Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everyone. Ready to jump into some controversial territory?
Always up for a good challenge, especially when it involves unpacking deeply ingrained beliefs.
Well, today's Deep Dive is going to do just that. We're tackling Michael Huemer's progressive myths.
He takes aim at some of those sacred cows, those progressive ideals that are often accepted without much scrutiny.
Like what? Give us a taste. What kind of myths are we talking about here?
Everything from racial bias in policing and the gender pay gap to those implicit bias tests, you know, the ones where they flash images and words at you. He really digs into the evidence behind these ideas and whether they hold up under closer examination.
So it's not just about blindly accepting those viral headlines and emotionally charged narratives we see everywhere.
Exactly. Humor encourages us to think critically, to look beyond those surface-level explanations, and consider alternative perspectives even when they challenge our deeply held beliefs.
And judging by the title, Progressive Myths, it seems like he's got some strong opinions about where those misleading narratives are coming from.
He does, but what's interesting is that he includes a chapter titled 3 Non-Myths, acknowledging instances where progressive claims were actually accurate.
Ah, so he's not just on a mission to debunk everything progressive, trying to be somewhat balanced then.
You could say that. I think it highlights his commitment to a genuine examination of the evidence, regardless of where it leads.
All right, so let's dive into some specifics. Where does he start? What are some of the key myths he tackles in this book?
Well, he kicks things off by dissecting some high-profile cases, those that sparked outrage and fueled social movements. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Amy Cooper, names many of our listeners will recognize.
Right, those cases were definitely flashpoints in our recent history.
And while the tragedies themselves were undeniable, Huemer argues that the dominant narratives surrounding them might not tell the whole story.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk us through one of those cases. How does he challenge those prevailing narratives?
Let's take the Trayvon Martin case. Remember, the media often portrayed Martin as a completely innocent teenager targeted solely due to his race.
Right, that was the narrative that really took hold.
And it undoubtedly played a significant role in sparking those early Black Lives Matter protests.
Absolutely. But is Huemer saying it wasn't about race at all?
Not necessarily. He presents evidence suggesting the situation was more complex than initially presented, details that maybe didn't get as much attention in the media frenzy.
So what kind of details is he talking about? Gotta admit, my memory of the specifics is a little fuzzy.
He points to things like the physical altercation between Martin and Zimmerman, the 911 calls that describe Martin as the aggressor, and forensic evidence that contradicted some of the initial claims about how the shooting occurred.
So he's not denying the tragedy or the role of race, but saying, hey, let's look at all the pieces of the puzzle before we jump to conclusions.
Exactly. He does the same with the Michael Brown case. Remember, hands up, don't shoot. That became a powerful rallying cry.
Oh yeah, I remember that. So what's his take on that?
Well, he highlights investigations that cast doubt on whether Brown actually had his hands up when he was shot. He brings up forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and the grand jury testimony that contradicted that widely disseminated image. So again, he's urging us to consider all angles, even if they challenge those initial assumptions that we might have formed based on those emotionally charged headlines. But he suggests that attributing it solely to systemic racism might be an oversimplification.
So what's he proposing as a more complete explanation?
He argues that while racial bias might be a factor, other variables like crime rates in specific neighborhoods and the frequency of police encounters in those areas might also play a significant role in those tragic outcomes. He brings in crime statistics and demographic data to support his argument.
So he's saying that it's not as simple as just saying racist cops, end of story.
Right. He wants us to look beyond single-cause explanations and grapple with the complexities of the issue. And this line of thinking continues when he delves into the concept of implicit bias.
Ah, implicit bias, that buzzword you hear everywhere these days. What's his take on that?
Well, he examines the research surrounding those implicit bias tests, the ones that measure unconscious biases. You know, those online quizzes that are supposed to reveal your hidden prejudices.
Yeah, I've seen those floating around social media.
Right, they're everywhere. But he raises some thought-provoking questions about their reliability and their ability to predict discriminatory behavior.
Wait, hold on. Is he suggesting that those tests don't actually mean anything?
He's suggesting that while they might reveal some unconscious associations, those associations don't necessarily translate into real-world discrimination.
Oh, I see. So just because I might unconsciously associate certain negative traits with a particular group doesn't mean I'm going to act on those associations when I'm, say, hiring someone for a job or interacting with someone on the street.
Exactly. It's not a direct one-to-one correlation.
That's interesting. I think a lot of people assume that those test results are a direct reflection of how someone will act in the real world.
And that's precisely the kind of assumption Huemer challenges. He pushes us to consider whether those implicit biases have a significant impact on behavior or whether we're placing too much weight on them.
So it's like he's saying, let's not jump to conclusions based on these tests alone. Let's look for more concrete evidence of actual discrimination rather than just relying on these unconscious associations.
Right, and he applies that same critical lens to the concept of stereotype threat.
Stereotype threat, remind me what that is again?
It's the idea that individuals might underperform in certain situations if they're aware of negative stereotypes about their group.
Like, if a woman is constantly being told that women are bad at math, she might feel anxious and actually perform worse on a math test because of that stereotype hanging over her head.
Exactly. And there's been quite a bit of research on this phenomenon, but here's where Huemer brings in his critical perspective.
Okay, lay it on us. What's his critique of stereotype threat?
He acknowledges that it's a real phenomenon, but he argues that its effects aren't always consistent, and that it may not be as significant a factor as some people believe when explaining things like achievement gaps between racial groups.
So, once again, he's encouraging us to look deeper, to consider the full spectrum of factors at play.
Right, he's saying, let's not just assume stereotype threat is the primary driver of these gaps. There might be other variables like socioeconomic factors, differences in access to quality education, cultural attitudes towards learning, all sorts of things that could be contributing.
It's like he's constantly pushing us to think more systematically, to look for multiple causes, rather than just attributing everything to one single factor.
And to base our conclusions on evidence, on data, rather than just relying on those emotionally appealing narratives that might not capture the full complexity of the issue.
Right, those simple stories that make us feel good, but might not actually reflect reality.
And this data-driven approach is really consistent throughout his book.
Okay, so we've seen how he tackles racial bias, implicit bias, stereotype threat. What other myths does he take on in this book?
Well, he doesn't shy away from controversial topics. He delves into drug laws, for instance.
Drug laws. Okay, that's a whole other can of worms. What's his angle there?
He addresses the claim that drug laws, particularly those concerning drugs like crack cocaine, were intentionally designed to disproportionately target Black communities. This narrative that these laws were crafted as a tool of racial oppression.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
It's a common one, but Huemer digs into the historical context and the legislative history of those laws.
So what does he find? Is he saying that there's no racial element to these laws at all?
Not exactly. He acknowledges that there are disparities in how those drug laws are enforced, and that those disparities have had a disproportionate impact on Black communities.
Which is definitely a problem that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. But he pushes back against the idea that the laws themselves were created with explicitly racist intent.
So while the application of those laws might be problematic, the intention behind them might have been more about just trying to control drug use in general.
That's what he argues. He suggests that those laws were primarily driven by concerns about the dangers of drug use, rather than being explicitly designed to target a particular racial group.
That's interesting. It definitely challenges a narrative that you often hear, and it seems like he's not trying to downplay the real harm that's been caused by these laws and their enforcement, but rather encouraging a more nuanced understanding of the issue.
Exactly. He wants us to look at the full picture, the historical context, the legislative intent, the societal forces that shaped those laws, and then consider how those laws have been applied and what their consequences have been.
It's a lot more complex than just saying racist drug laws. End of story.
Right. He's pushing back against those simplistic explanations, and that same commitment to nuance continues when he delves into another hot-button issue, the gender pay gap.
Oh boy, here we go. That's a topic guaranteed to generate some heated discussion.
It is, and Huemer doesn't shy away from it. He addresses that widely held belief that women earn significantly less than men for doing the same work solely because of systemic sexism.
Right, that there's this widespread discrimination against women in the workplace, leading to this persistent pay disparity.
Exactly. But he dives into the data. analyzes those studies on the pay gap, and looks at the various factors that contribute to those differences in earnings.
So what's he saying? Is he denying the existence of a pay gap? Or saying that sexism isn't a factor at all?
He's not denying that discrimination can play a role, but he argues that attributing the entire pay gap solely to sexism might be overlooking other significant factors. He points to things like occupational choices, the fact that women are more likely to choose careers in fields that tend to pay less than those dominated by men.
Okay, I've heard that argument before.
He also looks at differences in the number of hours worked. Women, on average, tend to work fewer hours than men, which obviously impacts their earnings.
Right, especially when you consider things like maternity leave and the fact that women often take on a larger share of childcare responsibilities.
Exactly. He also looks at years of experience in the workforce. Women might have career interruptions for family reasons, which can impact their overall earnings trajectory.
So he's painting a more complex picture, saying it's not just about men deliberately paying women less for the same work.
Right. He's arguing that there are multiple factors at play, and that while discrimination might be a part of the equation, it's not the whole story.
It's like he's saying, let's not oversimplify the issue. Let's look at the data, consider all the variables, and then have a more nuanced discussion about how to address those disparities.
Exactly. He wants us to move beyond those simplistic explanations and engage with the complexities of the issue.
Well, it certainly seems like Huemer is not afraid to challenge those conventional narratives and encourage a more critical way of thinking.
That's what makes this deep dive so valuable. He's prompting us to question our assumptions, look at the evidence, and form our own conclusions rather than just blindly accepting what we're told.
It's about becoming more informed and thoughtful citizens.
Exactly, and that's a skill that's crucial in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Now, we've only just scratched the surface of Huemer's progressive myths here.
Right, he goes on to explore a whole range of other myths, from campus rape culture to transgenderism and wealth inequality and more.
And we're going to delve into those in our next segment, so stay tuned.
Hey there, listeners. If you're finding value in our deep dives and want to dig even deeper, consider grabbing a copy through the Amazon link in the description below. And if you're an audiobook fan, you can dive in with a free 2-month Audible trial on us. Our gift to you. It's a great way to support the channel, explore amazing works on the go, and immerse yourself in these thought-provoking ideas. So, check out those links in the description, and thank you for supporting our work. And we'll keep the deep dives coming.
And we're back with part 2 of our deep dive into Michael Huemer's progressive myths.
Picking up where we left off, we're going to explore some even more controversial territory. Buckle up.
All right, hit me with it.
Yeah.
What's next on Huemer's myth-busting agenda?
He tackles the idea of a campus rape culture. You know, this notion that sexual assault is so pervasive on college campuses that it's become almost normalized.
Right, this idea that universities aren't doing enough to protect students and that there's this culture of silence around sexual assault.
Exactly, and there have been some high-profile cases and a lot of activism around this issue.
Definitely. So how does Huemer approach this? Is he denying that sexual assault is a problem on campuses?
No, he's not denying that it exists, but he does raise some questions about the statistics that are often used to support this idea of a pervasive rape culture.
What kind of questions?
Well, for instance, he looks at the definitions used in some studies, like how is sexual assault being defined? Is it including a broad range of behaviors or focusing on a very specific type of assault?
I see. So the way you define the problem can obviously impact the numbers you end up with.
Exactly. And he also questions the methodologies used in some studies, like how are they gathering their data? Are they relying on self-reported surveys? Are they using consistent methods across different studies?
Right, because if your methods aren't rigorous, then your results might not be that reliable.
Precisely. And he suggests that in some cases, the definitions and methodologies used might be inflating those statistics, making the problem appear larger than it actually is.
Okay, so he's not saying sexual assault isn't happening, but that maybe some of the numbers being thrown around aren't as accurate as they could be?
Right. And he argues that using those potentially inflated statistics can actually be counterproductive. It can create this sense of panic and fear that might not be entirely warranted.
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to knee-jerk reactions and solutions that aren't really addressing the root of the problem.
Exactly. And it can also make it harder to have those nuanced, evidence-based conversations that are necessary to actually address the issue effectively.
Right. If we're starting from a place of fear and exaggeration, we might not be making the best decisions.
Exactly. Now, along those same lines, he also tackles the claim that women don't lie about sexual assault.
Ah, that's a tricky one. Because on the one hand, you want to believe survivors. You want to create a space where they feel safe to come forward and report these crimes.
Absolutely. And he acknowledges that. He says that false reports are a minority of cases.
Okay, but he's not dismissing the possibility altogether.
He's saying we can't just ignore it. He argues that those false reports aren't negligible.
So there's a balance to be struck, right? Between believing survivors and also recognizing that there's always a possibility, however small, that someone might make a false accusation.
Right. He says that ignoring that possibility can lead to a lack of due process and potentially harm innocent individuals.
It's about finding that balance between supporting victims and ensuring fairness in the process.
Exactly. And he advocates for an approach that takes both of those considerations seriously. One that doesn't just blindly accept every accusation, but also doesn't dismiss them out of hand.
Okay, so we talked about campus rape culture and false accusations. What other gender myths does he debunk?
He delves into some really fundamental questions about gender itself. Like, what is gender? Is it purely a social construct? Is it entirely separate from biological sex?
Those are definitely hot topics these days. Lots of debate about gender identity and the whole nature versus nurture thing.
Absolutely. And Huemer doesn't shy away from those debates. He examines those claims that gender is solely a social construct, completely divorced from biology.
So is he saying it's all about biology? That gender is just determined by your chromosomes?
No, it's not that simple. He acknowledges that there are social and cultural influences on how we understand and express gender.
Right, like those traditional gender roles and expectations that vary across cultures.
Exactly. But he argues that we can't entirely dismiss the role of biology.
So he's saying it's a combination of nature and nurture.
In a sense, yes. He suggests that there are biological differences between sexes, and those differences can't be completely ignored when talking about gender.
Okay, so he's advocating for a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between biology and gender, recognizing that it's complex and not easily reduced to one simple explanation.
Exactly. Now, from there, he delves into the very sensitive and often heated topic of transgenderism.
That's one that always gets people fired up.
It does, and Huemer approaches it carefully. He examines the claim that gender identity is entirely innate and fixed from birth, and that affirming a person's self-identified gender, regardless of their biological sex, is always the best approach.
Right, that idea of just accepting and supporting someone's self-identified gender without question.
Exactly. And he acknowledges the importance of supporting transgender individuals and addressing the very real challenges they face, like discrimination and prejudice.
But he's not just blindly accepting that affirmation is always the answer.
He's encouraging a more critical examination of the issue. He looks at the evidence surrounding gender dysphoria, which is that distress a person experiences when their gender identity doesn't align with their assigned sex at birth.
So he's not denying that gender dysphoria exists.
No, not at all. But he's questioning whether automatic, unquestioning affirmation is always the best approach.
So what is he suggesting? What's his alternative?
He's advocating for a more nuanced approach that takes into account the individual's specific situation, their history, their mental health, all those factors. He's saying that maybe in some cases, other forms of therapy or support might be more appropriate.
So it's not about denying anyone's identity, but rather looking at the whole picture and figuring out what's truly best for that individual person.
Right. He's encouraging us to move beyond those rigid ideologies and really grapple with the complexities of these issues.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground on gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
What other areas does Huemer explore in this book?
Well, he shifts gears a bit and tackles some economic myths as well.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, he starts with this idea of generational wealth. You know, this notion that wealth inequality is primarily due to rich families just passing down their fortunes from one generation to the next.
Right, that it's all about inheritance and that the deck is stacked against those who aren't born into privilege.
Exactly, and it's a narrative that's often used to justify things like wealth redistribution and higher taxes on the wealthy.
So what's Huemer's take on this? Is he saying that inherited wealth doesn't play a role in inequality?
He's not saying it doesn't play any role, but he presents data that challenges the idea that it's the primary driver of wealth inequality.
What kind of data?
He looks at the number of wealthy individuals who are actually self-made, who built their fortunes through their own businesses rather than just inheriting it all.
So he's saying that while inheritance exists, It's not the sole explanation for why some people are rich and others aren't.
Exactly. He argues that there are other factors at play, like hard work, talent, risk-taking, innovation, and even just luck.
Right, because not everyone who inherits wealth manages to hold on to it or grow it.
Precisely. And not everyone who's born poor stays poor. There's social mobility, people moving up and down the economic ladder. It's not this fixed system where your destiny is determined by your family background.
Okay, so if it's not all about inheritance, then what is driving those wealth disparities, according to Huemer?
That's the question he wants us to grapple with. He's saying that it's a complex issue and that maybe we need to look beyond those simplistic explanations that blame it all on inheritance or greed.
So he's pushing back against those easy answers that fit neatly into a particular ideology.
Exactly. He's saying, let's dig deeper. Let's look at the data. Let's consider all the variables.
That seems to be a recurring theme in this book. This desire to move beyond those simple narratives and really grapple with the complexities of these issues.
Absolutely. And that same critical thinking applies when he tackles the claim that the wealthy don't pay their fair share of taxes.
Oh, that's a classic. You hear that all the time.
You do. But Huemer, as always, wants us to look at the evidence. So he dives into tax data.
And what does he find?
He finds that higher income individuals already pay a disproportionately large share of the total tax revenue.
Wait, really? So those claims that the rich are getting away with not paying their fair share, those aren't entirely accurate.
That's what Huemer argues. He suggests that the current tax system is more progressive than many people believe.
So he's not saying that everything is perfectly fair, but he's saying that maybe the situation isn't as dire as some make it out to be.
Right. He's saying, let's look at the actual numbers before we start making sweeping pronouncements about who's paying what.
Data over dogma.
Exactly. And he takes that same approach when addressing the issue of regulation.
Regulation as in government regulation of businesses and industries.
Yes. He tackles the claim that more regulation is always better, that we need the government to step in and protect consumers and the environment from those evil corporations.
Which is a pretty common argument.
It is. But Huemer challenges this idea by highlighting the potential downsides of excessive regulation.
Such as?
Well, he argues that overly burdensome regulations can stifle innovation, make it harder for new businesses to start up, and drive up costs for everyone.
Right, because if businesses have to comply with a ton of regulations, they're going to pass those costs on to consumers.
Exactly. And he also argues that those regulations can sometimes be ineffective or even counterproductive. They might not actually achieve the intended goals of protecting consumers or the environment.
So he's not against all regulation, right? But he's saying that we need to be more thoughtful about it, to weigh the potential benefits against the potential costs.
Right. He wants us to be more aware of those unintended consequences.
It's like he's saying that we need to be skeptical of any claim that there's a simple one-size-fits-all solution to complex problems.
Exactly. And that we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions, even when those assumptions are based on beliefs we hold dear.
That's a good reminder, because it's easy to fall into those ideological traps where we just accept anything that confirms our worldview.
It is, and that's why Huemer's book is so valuable. He's pushing us to be more critical thinkers, to engage with different perspectives, and to base our beliefs on evidence rather than just blind faith.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive so far. We've explored a lot of those progressive myths and heard Huemer's critiques.
We have. And in our final segment, we're going to delve into some even more challenging territory.
Okay, I'm ready for it. Bring on the controversy. We spent the last 2 segments unpacking Michael Huemer's progressive myths, and it's been quite a journey challenging a lot of those commonly held beliefs. Definitely
a lot to unpack there. From racial bias and gender dynamics to economic assumptions, Huemer really pushes us to look beyond those surface-level explanations we often hear.
What strikes me is his approach. He doesn't just dismiss these progressive ideas outright. It's not about saying everything you believe is wrong.
Right. He's more about encouraging that critical thinking, like, let's look at the evidence. Let's consider different perspectives. Let's not just accept things blindly.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable, I think. It's about equipping our listeners with the tools to think for themselves, to be more discerning consumers of information.
Absolutely. It's not about telling people what to think, but rather how to think.
So for our listeners who are now fired up, ready to dig deeper into all of this, where would you steer them? What's the best way to explore these ideas further?
Well, obviously, I highly recommend reading Michael Huemer's book, Progressive Myths. It's definitely a thought-provoking read, and actually you can find it on Audible.
Oh, perfect for those who like to listen on the go.
Exactly. And there's a special offer for our listeners. If you follow the link in the description, you can start a free trial with Audible and dive right into Progressive Myths.
Awesome. We'll be sure to include that link. And we always love hearing from you, our listeners. So what surprised you during this deep dive? Any myths that you found particularly compelling or controversial?
Yeah, jump into the comments below and let us know your thoughts. We love a good discussion.
Absolutely. And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating and, well, sometimes controversial topics. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Keep those minds open and keep questioning everything.